Summer is supposed to be an opportunity to slow down, but when you look at your kids, you can't help but notice that your kids are growing up fast. Help them build independence as they grow with Greenlight. Greenlight is a debit card and money app for families, where parents can keep an eye on kids' money habits while kids learn how to save, invest, and spend wisely. It's the easy, convenient way to raise financially smart kids. Get your first month free when you sign up at greenlight.com/Spotify.
Well, we got a minute. I'm gonna buy that truck I've been wanting.
Wait, don't you need like weeks to shop for a car?
I don't. Carvana makes it super convenient to find exactly what I want.
Hold up. You're buying a car on your phone? Isn't that more of a laptop thing?
You can shop wherever you want.
I like to do my research, read reviews, compare models. Plus, Carvana has thousands of options. How'd you decide on that truck?
Because I like it.
Oh, that is a great reason.
Go to Carvana.com to sell your car the convenient way.
Three weeks ago, most Democrats had never heard of Tim Walz. Walz is the governor of Minnesota, a veteran, a former teacher, and back in July, he was a guest on MSNBC.
That angst that J.D. Vance talks about in Hillbilly Elegy, none of my hillbilly cousins went to Yale, and none of them went on to be venture capitalists or whatever. It's not who people...
He was talking about J.D. Vance, making the point that Vance, for all his talk about his rural background, had a penchant for policies that wrecked rural America and divided everyone else.
This division, we do not like what has happened where we can't even go to Thanksgiving dinner with our uncle because you end up in some weird fight that is unnecessary. and I think bringing back people together, well, it's true, these guys are just weird. And it's, you know, they're running for He-Man Women Haters Club or something. That's what they go at. That's not what people are interested in.
This term, weird, it spread like wildfire among Democrats.
And so I guess what I would most want to see in that debate, whoever is at the table with him, is getting into that relationship between a strange worldview and a strange set of policies.
It's 1-2. Go after them and show their falsities and craziness when they do these nutty things that they're doing, these weird things that they're doing. But at the same time...
Even Joe Manchin, a man who left the Dems, got in on the action.
It's about the childless cat lady
I've
comment.
never heard of that. That was a weird comment I've never heard before.
He basically was criticizing women who, political leaders who don't have kids.
I just never heard the comment. The way it was, it's just a very weird way of saying something. If you don't like somebody, if you're against somebody, then say it.
Suddenly, after one interview, millions of Americans knew Tim Walz.
And it kind of catapulted him from a relatively, I think, obscure governor to somebody who was suddenly on Kamala Harris's shortlist.
That's David Faris. He teaches politics at Roosevelt University. But before Tuesday morning, he was not sure Tim Walz would be Harris's pick for vice president. And to be fair, no one was.
His sort of rocket-like ascent into the upper tier is just evidence that, like, whatever you think the shortlist is in the spring of the election year can change really quickly. That speculation about like who are the 4 or 5 people that would be most suitable for this nomination, you know, none of the initial names made it this far. So it's definitely a surprising pick. I don't think anybody would have thought that this would happen 2 months ago.
That said, did anyone think any of this would happen 2 months ago? Until the start of July, the 2024 presidential race felt boring. We knew the candidates, we knew the issues, we knew their problems. But then Trump was almost assassinated. And then Biden dropped out. And then Kamala Harris became his heir apparent. And now we have Walz.
This is a risk, right? Minnesota is only a swing state if a lot of other things have gone wrong for Democrats, right? So, it's a bold choice to have what is, in effect, like a left ticket. I think the expectation is that Harris, who had a very, very liberal voting record in the U.S. Senate, would choose someone with like a little bit more of a moderate record. And Walz did have a moderate record in Congress, but as the Minnesota governor, he has been a very progressive governor of that state. And so that's an unusual choice. It's a bold choice. It signals Harris's determination to kind of shift the ideological direction of the party a little bit. You know, the decision to say, like, we're just not going to do a candidate from a swing state and gamble on your strength across the board nationally makes me a little bit nervous, to be honest. And so, you know, I don't have a decisive, I love it, I hate it. I think there are clear upsides and clear downsides to this pick. And I just hope the Harris campaign has gamed all of them out.
Today on the show, meet Tim Walz, 2024's latest curveball. I'm Mary C. Curtis, in for Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around.
This episode is brought to you by SAP. First, the bad news. SAP Business AI will not help you generate cubist versions of your family's holiday photos, but it will help you understand which supplier is best to help you roll out your plant-based packaging in Southeast Asia, or identify the training your junior project manager needs to rise up the ranks, or automate repetitive tasks while you focus on big innovations. So you can be ready for the next opportunity. Revolutionary technology, real-world results. That's SAP Business AI.
This show is brought to you by The Washington Post. If you listen to this podcast, you care about what's going on in the world. To get even more great coverage of our crazy world, check out The Washington Post. Of course, I turn straight to the politics section of the Post. I can count on the paper's reporters and columnists to give me the news I need to do my job, but there's so much more in its pages, from world news to food features to the special reports that enlighten and inform. Diving into the Post is a morning habit I don't intend to break. Right now, go to WashingtonPost.com/whatnext, and you can subscribe for just 50 cents per week for your first year. With the Washington Post, keep up to date on topics like Capitol Hill, the economy, climate change, foreign policy, and much more. When you're in a rush and need to catch up quickly on the day's most important and interesting stories, the Post's The 7 newsletter is a quick commute read sent each morning. Plus, it's also available as a podcast. With the election rapidly approaching, now is the time to sign up for the Washington Post. Go to WashingtonPost.com/whatnext to subscribe for just 50 cents per week for your first year. That's 80% off their typical offer, so this is truly a steal. Once again, that's WashingtonPost.com/whatnext to subscribe for just 50 cents per week for your first year. So, meet Tim Walz, born and raised in small-town Nebraska. Before he was a politician, he was a teacher in Mankato, Minnesota, where he taught geography and coached the high school football team. He was also the faculty advisor for the school's first Gay-Straight Alliance chapter in 1999, long before Democrats stood for gay rights nationally. Walz also served in the National Guard for 24 years after enlisting at 17. That role took him around the country and on a deployment to Europe. David says, basically, Walz isn't from the Ivy League clerk-to-lawyer pipeline that dominates parts of the Democratic Party.
He does have a sort of a pre-political work history that sounds like a life story that somebody you went to high school with. You know, he kind of ticks all the boxes in terms of his bio, right? Like, you got a military background, you got a public school teacher, somebody that adopted some progressive positions as a much younger person before they were fashionable, and who then went on to compile a very successful record as governor. And he was a member of the U.S. Congress before he became governor. He's had a little bit of a transformation, right? So he had a fairly moderate voting record as a member of the U.S. House. But as the governor, he has a long record of implementing progressive policy ideas in all sorts of different kinds of realms. And of course, he was the governor during the summer of 2020, during the George Floyd protests, which originated in Minnesota, right? So in that sense, he's a little bit more well-known nationally, I think, than like a random blue state governor that hasn't gotten any national press. Like, there was a time where people were talking about his management of the George Floyd situation.
Let's delve into a little bit more of some of the issues that he did take a stand on, both in Congress and as governor.
Sure. I think as much as I think the right is going to run with like he's a progressive extremist, the things that they've done in Minnesota have actually quite broad appeal in public opinion surveys, right? So that's things like free school lunches and expanding healthcare for families. That's things like paid family and medical leave, which, you know, have supermajority support among the broader population, right? Like America is like the only country in the OECD that doesn't offer any days of paid leave for any reason as a matter of national policy, right? We leave it all to private employers or to the state if the state is the employer. And so being the first state to really pursue a policy of paid family and medical leave, I think was an extremely bold move. And so that record as governor, I think, plays into the Harris campaign's messaging, right? Which is going to be about reproductive rights. It's going to be about freedom. But it's also going to be about like legitimately pro-family policies. And that's where I think Walz really shines.
Walz has also evolved on issues like gun rights. During his early years in Congress, he received endorsements from the National Rifle Association and had an A rating from the group. But after the mass shooting in Las Vegas back in 2017, he gave donations from the NRA to charity, and he supported an assault weapons ban after the 2018 school shooting in Parkland. Since becoming governor, Walz has signed into law bills that restrict gun use in Minnesota, but he'd likely describe himself as a moderate on the issue.
Yeah, I mean, he's a gun owner, right? So he's not going to be somebody that's going to go out there and be like, we should have no guns, right? Which is not a realistic proposition in America anyway. But I do think that he'd be a good salesman for the Democratic Party's current line on this, right? Which is about targeted policies to, for example, to ban what we call assault weapons or to strengthen the background check system. But like the things that Walz says he's evolved on, have very broad appeal, right? Like most Americans don't think that you should be able to walk into a store and buy an assault weapon that could like gun down an entire British regiment in 2 minutes. Like people don't necessarily think that's like what the founders had in mind, right? So that evolution, I think, is relatable, right? And relatability is a key part of his appeal. And he can say, look, I'm a gun owner, right? I used to be in a different place on this, but having seen what's gone on in America over the past 15 or 20 years has just compelled me to change my policy positions.
You know, one thing I'm impressed with is the spread of the endorsements that Walz got during the Veep stakes, from Jim McGovern, the top Democrat on the Rules Committee, all the way to Pramila Jayapal, the head of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and even former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. That's some real ideological range. How does he line up ideologically with Harris?
It's a great question, and it's a tough question to answer, because if you lined up his congressional voting record with Harris's, he's substantially to the right of her during his time in Congress. But if you focus solely on his record as governor, he seems to have a pretty close ideological affinity to Harris. And that means that this choice was made not necessarily for ideological balance within the Democratic Party. That's something that we've seen candidates do in the past to varying degrees of success, right? Like in 2004, John Kerry, who was, of course, being caricatured as a New England liberal, picked kind of a centrist Southern senator named John Edwards, who, of course, turned out to have really significant personal problems that became a huge liability later in his career. But at the time, that was an ideological balance pick. And that doesn't really seem to be what's going on here. What seems to be going on here is less about Walz's ideology than about his background and his theoretical appeal to groups that Democrats have been slipping with over the last 20 years. And so that, to me, is it's kind of a unique approach to the running mate pick. If it works, of course, Harris will deserve a lot of kudos for making that bold choice, right? But it is to not balance the ticket ideologically is a risk that I think we all need to be aware of.
But that's not to say Walz won't broaden the ticket's appeal.
The key thing that Democrats have lost over the past 20 years is their appeal to folks who didn't go to college or who didn't finish college. And it's like, Walz did finish college, right? But choosing someone who is outside of that sort of Ivy League elitist framework is supposed to appeal to Democrats in non-urban settings where we know that we're not going to win these groups as Democrats, but you do need to keep the losses to something reasonable. And I think that Walz is somebody who can make a better claim to be able to connect with working folks, people who have trouble paying the bills, for whom politics is largely an abstraction that they are forced to pay attention to every 4 years because they're asked to make this choice, but for whom politics is not central.
David, I know we've touched on these already, but quickly, could you list what are the main pros and cons of Walz as the VP pick?
I think some of the pros are a kind of like a folksy speaking style that's a good contrast to Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket. His background as an educator, as a kind of a regular guy who's a dad, has a lot of photographs floating around of him with like farm animals and things like that. Right, like he has real street cred in terms of being somebody who has a life story and a background that might appeal to people in rural areas, to white working class voters, and also has a tremendous record of progressive policy accomplishment at the state level that should help with the left flank of the party, right? So as a person, he covers a lot of ground inside the party in terms of what we think his potential appeal would be. Another thing that he's done with all of his media appearances is he has proven himself to be a very capable attack dog for the ticket, right? Like traditionally, the vice president has played the role of running a more negative campaign against the top of the opposition's ticket. And Walz really seems to do that with gusto. And so I think that they think of him as somebody that's like going to do really well against J.D. Vance if they debate.
That's the debate I really want to see, too.
Yeah, me too.
And his weaknesses?
His weaknesses, I think, one, he's not from a critical swing state. And in an election that everybody thinks is going to be quite close, not being from Pennsylvania, Arizona, or Michigan, or Wisconsin in particular, is a drawback. It just is, right? Like if you believe the research that running mates have an effect on their home state, picking someone from a state that's not like one of the the 3 or 4 critical states in the election is a pretty significant risk. His other downside, I think, is a little bit more aesthetic. He's 60, but he looks older than 60. And I think in a situation where Democrats just had this like massive public freakout about how their nominee is too old, picking someone who presents as a little bit older might have some downside risk. But like the thing that people don't like about Walz is like he's not from a swing state, and there's nothing he can do about that. And I think that the Harris campaign is clearly gambling that his other strengths are more important in a broader sense than what state that he's from.
After the break, why Walz may have beaten out other VP contenders.
This episode is brought to you by SAP. First, the bad news. SAP Business AI will not help you generate cubist versions of your family's holiday photos, but it will help you understand which supplier is best to help you roll out your plant-based packaging in Southeast Asia, or identify the training your junior project manager needs to rise up the ranks, or automate repetitive tasks while you focus on big innovations. So you can be ready for the next opportunity. Revolutionary technology, real-world results. That's SAP Business AI. This episode is brought to you by SAP. First, the bad news. SAP Business AI will not help you generate cubist versions of your family's holiday photos, but it will help you understand which supplier is best to help you roll out your plant-based packaging in Southeast Asia, or identify the training your junior project manager needs to rise up the ranks, or automate repetitive tasks while you focus on big innovations. So you can be ready for the next opportunity. Revolutionary technology, real-world results. That's SAP Business AI.
Until a few days ago, most pundits agreed that the VP frontrunner wasn't Walz. It was Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro.
Shapiro is a first-term governor of Pennsylvania. He's extremely popular in his home state. Like the Morning Consult polling gives him a net favorability of like 29 points, which is like, which is a pretty wild number for a deeply divided state. And he has a shorter list of legislative accomplishments because Democrats don't control the legislature in Pennsylvania. So he has more of a, things that they have put into law have been more on the bipartisan nature. He has, obviously stopped a bunch of Republican priorities from becoming law. But that's just, it's a very different background. He took a fairly combative stance towards the campus protests about Gaza. He was someone who called for example, the president of the University of Pennsylvania to step aside after her testimony before Congress about anti-Semitism on campus. Some folks on the left didn't like that. And I think the feeling on the left was that like too much force was being called for and used against these campus protesters. And so unfortunately, the perception for Shapiro became that he might cause problems within the Democratic coalition. Not necessarily because he's Jewish or because he supports a two-state solution in Israel-Palestine, which is like pretty standard boilerplate national Democratic positioning. But I think more specifically because of this posture vis-a-vis the protesters, that he might undo some of the progress that the Harris campaign made virtually overnight with 18 to 29-year-olds.
When did the table start to turn on Shapiro? What wound up being his primary liabilities?
I think that we'll find out what was considered to be his primary liability in the coming days and weeks. I'm not sure that we exactly know right now. There was a thing that happened in 2023, in October 2023, in which one of Shapiro's top aides had to resign because of a sexual harassment scandal. And I'm not sure that anybody has the full story. I think there was some concern, about like what Shapiro knew and when he knew it. And whether he participated in some kind of cover-up of this behavior or at least kind of looked the other way. And I think given the centrality of women to the Democratic coalition, the Harris campaign may have concluded that that was actually the biggest problem, especially given the accelerated nature of this timeline. I don't know that there's any way that they could have done like a thorough like FBI level background check on these candidates prior to this election because it just had to get done. And so it may have been a little bit of like, Harris would have had to take it on good faith that there was no more to this story than we already know. And she may have been uncomfortable with that. She may have just not had good personal chemistry with Josh Shapiro.
David, at the same time, some Shapiro boosters say passing him over may be read as anti-Israel, even anti-Semitic. Do you think that's a perception that Harris will need to contend with?
I think that there will be some talking points on the political right about, people on the far right already talk about Democrats as having, and I quote, a Hamas wing. And so I think that that's a message that they're going to have a good line about. This is part and parcel of making Shapiro a front runner and making it clear that he was on the short list and then had made it down to the final, 2 or 3 names and then to pass him over. I think it just, it'll be a stretch to call it anti-Semitic, not to pick him, but certainly they will have to be very clear that Shapiro's positions on Israel and, of course, his ethnic and religious background had nothing at all to do with why he was passed over for Walz. I think they just need to tell a story about why they thought Walz was the best choice.
Much has been made of the accelerated election season, and this VP selection is no exception. This process usually plays out over months. Candidates sometimes start vetting VP candidates before they even secure their party's nomination. And there's a reason for that. You want to turn up any potential dirt before the other party's ticket has a chance to. So is there a risk that there are skeletons in Tim Walz's closet that have yet to come to light?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's a story going around this morning about a DUI that Tim Walz got in the 1990s. I think one thing to keep in mind is that the bar for a serious scandal has been raised like extremely high by Donald Trump. Right. So I think in the United States of 2024, the fact that Tim Walz had a DUI 30 years ago is not going to be a huge issue. But certainly the compressed timeline means that you are going to just have to take some risks that you might not otherwise have taken. So I don't think that there's any perfect vetting process. You just have to hope that they did as much as they could with the time that they had.
How have Republicans reacted to Walz? Any indications on what they'll hit him with?
My prediction is that they're going to lean into the leftist radical critique. So they're going to seize upon his record in Minnesota as a tax and spender with progressive priorities, right? Like progressive has become a kind of a term of abuse on the right. And they're using the word progressive to code all kinds of things that they don't like as too radical for the ordinary American. So I think that what they're going to do is they're going to paint the ticket as super liberal, outside the mainstream. I don't expect them to do it with a lot of message discipline, given who's at the top of their ticket. But I think that the easy attack here is that Harris is a radical leftist, and she picked a radical leftist as a running mate, and they want to bring big city politics to the rest of America.
As Harris's own political history shows, choosing a Veep can be tantamount to anointing your successor. So I'm wondering, does Tim Walz represent the future of the Democratic Party?
I mean, it's a tough question because, in terms of how old he is, it's tough to sell him as the future of the party. But I think that he could easily be sold as somebody who has the policy chops and the personal style to appeal to a broad cross section of Democratic voters and independents, while still having a vision of what the party should be doing in power that has broad appeal.
So you think this choice is more about strategizing on how to win this particular election with this particular candidate at the top of the ticket?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think that most nominees don't necessarily think too hard about, how is this person going to play in 4 to 8 to 12 years? They want to win. And to the extent that running mates can help you win, that is the key consideration, or at least it should be, right? I think in 2016, you can look at Hillary Clinton's choice of Tim Kaine as maybe a pretty significant mistake. It didn't shore up a swing state. It didn't add ideological balance to the ticket. It became a ticket of two moderates at a time when a lot of progressives in the party were up in arms about the primary between Clinton and Bernie Sanders. And I think thinking back, it doesn't seem like Tim Kaine brought much to the ticket. Did he hurt it? Did he hurt it? No. Right. But I think that this is a bolder choice built around the idea that the running mate can have broad coalitional appeal to different subgroups of the party's coalition, but also truly independent-minded voters will be willing to take a look at this guy and maybe find some appeal there.
Thank you, David Faris, for coming on What Next?
Thanks, Mary. It was really nice to be here, and very exciting day to think about this election.
David Faris is an associate professor of political science at Roosevelt University. He's also the author of The Kids Are All Left, and It's Time to Fight Dirty. That's the show. If you're a fan of What Next, the best way to support our work is to join Slate Plus. Go to slate.com/whatnextplus to sign up. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, and Madeline Ducharme. We're led by Alicia Montgomery, with a little help from Susan Matthews. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary C. Curtis, columnist at Roll Call and host of its Equal Time podcast. Find me on Twitter. I'm at mcurtisnc3. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.
Is your vehicle stopping like it should? Does it squeal or grind when you brake? Don't miss out on summer brake deals at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.